Hi, everybody, and welcome to the third part of episode 6 in my Piano to Orchestra series. In part 2, I composed a 3 to 4 minute piece based on a looping chord progression. There are 6 complete repetitions of the piece, and today I'd like to just orchestrate the first of those 6 sections. It's only 8 measures long, but I'd like to orchestrate this opening several different ways. If you've been watching my channel for a while, first of all, thank you. But secondly, you'll know that I often go into a lot of detail about my composition and orchestration decisions. I try to thoroughly discuss all of my options and why I might pick one decision over another. So today will be no exception. I'll be posting the MIDI files, Dorico file, Cubase file, audio stems, and for the first time, the Studio One project file to my Patreon page. So check that out if you're interested, and you can follow along with all of my orchestration choices here today. All right, so let's talk about this opening A section. The first decision I have to make is sort of a translation issue going from piano to orchestral instruments. The piano has a relatively strong attack and a quickly fading sustain. Even with the pedal down, the sustain is very quiet relative to the initial attack. Most orchestral instruments don't behave this way, however. Strings, brass, and woodwinds can sustain a note with consistent dynamics throughout the duration of the note. So I have to ask myself, did I rearticulate this note in the upper staff because I wanted a rhythmic rearticulation every 2 beats? Or did I rearticulate the note because the piano note faded away too quickly? Because that decision will impact how I translate this upper staff material and the passage in general to instruments. I'll try it both ways. Let me start by placing these 2 lines divided between violins 1 and 2. I'll focus on the string section now, and then maybe look at other sections in a bit. In terms of which string instruments to assign to each part, splitting the part up like this makes the most sense. The range of notes really only works well for violins and violas, but if using violas, I'd probably only give them the lower staff line. The safest option is probably just violins, though. A direct copy-paste from the piano score above to the violins might sound something like this. The repeated high B in the first violins stands out more than it did in piano. You really hear the rhythm of the meter almost like a pulse, even at this slow tempo. If I instead wanted stillness without the pulse, I could reduce the number of rearticulations using slurs and combining repeated notes. First, I'll just cut the number of rearticulations in half. So the first violins rearticulate that high B now once every measure, and for both violin sections, there's only 1 bow change per measure. We hear the pulse differently now that we're de-emphasizing beat 3 in each measure. But unlike the piano, you still obviously hear the notes sustaining through the measure, so we're really not losing anything in the harmony or in the counterpoint by doing this. I'll cut the number of rearticulations in half once again. Now you start to hear these longer 2-measure phrases emerge. Thus, we perceive the pulse as slower and calmer. think I prefer it this way, so now that I've figured out bowings and note lengths, I can explore string technique and timbre. If I handed this music notated as is to an orchestra, it would sound close to the mock-up you just heard, although significantly more musical and less synthetic, but in terms of tone and technique, it would be similar. The players would play with a bit of vibrato using an ordinary bowing technique and unmuted by default. As the composer or orchestrator, you might want to consider all of those things to really shape the sound to your liking. If you want a completely still sound with hardly any motion, then perhaps you want to indicate non-vibrato in the opening passage. I find that the non-vibrato playing actually works well here. My goal for this opening is, in fact, to start with very little motion and expressiveness, and we usually associate vibrato with expressive playing. If you want the opposite of that, or a lot of expressiveness, you could notate molto espressivo or molto vibrato in the score. That sort of goes against what I want in this opening, so perhaps I'll save that for later in the piece. There are various other timbral choices to make here. Instead of ordinary bowing, I could have them play with tasto bowings, which eliminates some of the higher, harsher frequencies in the sound, creating a slightly softer, slightly warmer timbre. In the high register, it sounds more fragile, so it might work really well for this opening. There are several other standard techniques that I probably wouldn't consider for this opening. Tremolo, for instance, creates a lot of tension and energy, even at soft dynamics. I'm not sure that it fits with what I'm going for, but if tension is exactly what you want, consider marking the dynamics of the tremolo down to pianissimo to try and tame some of the aggressive tremolo sound. Some other techniques like harmonics might work, maybe in combination with other instruments. They're a bit weak on their own, so starting the piece with long sustaining harmonics might not be wise. Perhaps when I start adding other instruments, I'll try harmonics. The last thing I'll try here is muting the violins. Muting the strings removes some mid to higher harmonics, so the timbre is a bit more mellow and the volume is reduced. And when muting, you still have additional options like how much vibrato to use, or where the player bows the string, for instance, sol tasto bowing. Okay, it's about time I try adding some additional instruments. I like violins on this opening, so instead of removing them, I'll simply color these lines with other instruments. I'll start by adding woodwinds. In the past, I've discussed doubling lines in octaves, but in this case, I'd be very cautious about doubling anything down the octave. I placed these lines above the treble clef staff for a reason. I want it to sound high, and gradually as the piece develops into the next section, it will get lower. So I could imagine that doubling up the octave might work depending on the instrument, but probably not down the octave. Of all the woodwinds, I think flutes are my best option. I'll mute the strings again and then double each violin part with a solo flute. The flutes add clarity to the individual lines, and the hollow, gentle timbre fits stylistically with what I'm going for. There's a delicate, fragile, and airy quality to the flutes at a low dynamic level. If the top line were to go much higher, it might start to sound a bit strained. So fortunately, the register here works okay. Like the strings, I could also specify non-vibrato here on flutes for a more static, colder sound altogether. If you wanted, you could also specify a point at which the instruments switch from non-vibrato to perhaps poco vibrato and then normal vibrato. Think of it like a spectrum. The more vibrato, the more expressive the sound. But next, I think I'll try adding a second woodwind color. Instead of having two of the same instruments, I could try having a flute on the top line and an oboe on the second line. I could, of course, keep the non-vibrato, but I think poco vibrato might work better. And instead of keeping all 8 measures one uniform static texture, I'll start to think about how I might let this texture evolve over time. Nothing too crazy, the music doesn't call for that here, but I could add in a second flute and a second oboe during the second 4-measure phrase. That will just hopefully make it seem like we're building this texture very gradually from the beginning. The whole point of this piece, after all, is to build this texture and chord progression over time, so I might consider starting that process even within the first 8 measures. Another option would be to have strings on one line and woodwinds on the other. I'm inclined to let strings be given the more sustaining notes, almost in a background role, and upper winds can be given the moving line. Returning to this piano score for a second, I'll try and divide this up so that these more static parts of the texture are more obviously in the background. And I mentioned earlier that doubling something up the octave could potentially work, and I think that this would be especially true if it was more of a background sustaining texture up the octave. As you can see, I have first violins up the octave and seconds at the original octave, but both violin sections are clearly now on background pedal sustains. Even when the original top line material starts to move around measure 4 till the end, I keep the violins static except for the last measure where I felt that pedal B wouldn't work as well. So looking at the woodwinds, both a solo flute and a solo oboe start in unison playing the original lower material part, but then the flutes break off into the upper moving part in the second half, and oboes continue with the lower line. One other thing worth pointing out, I made an effort this time to let the first flute have a place to breathe here, so I give that pickup note into measure 5 to the second flute. Woodwind players will sneak in a breath between phrases, but in this particular case, the pickup note connects the two phrases here, so a breath would interrupt that. So here's what this sounds like altogether. so I'm pretty happy with this basic configuration of winds and strings, but for fun, I'll experiment with the strings timbre as I did previously. I haven't tried harmonics yet, so let's see how that sounds. I'll try just one more less common technique. Here I have the violins bowing with the wood of their bow, a technique called legno tratto. I know a lot of string players don't love using this technique, so that's something to keep in mind. It has a very soft, very strange, but interesting sound. I'll have both sections in unison on this pedal B. It's best to keep this legno tratto part fairly simple for it to be effective. So it might seem like I've exhausted all of the possible color and timbre combinations, but really I've just scratched the surface. I'm not going to demonstrate them all, of course, but as you do this more and more, you'll start to have instincts about what might work and what won't work. With most of these timbral effects, like harmonics or sol tasto, I could choose to mute the strings or add tremolo or some aleatoric randomness. I could choose to cut the string section in half for a more intimate, softer sound, and all of these decisions will affect the music. And even without hearing them in the sample libraries, you should learn to have a pretty good idea of what each articulation and effect will sound like. And today I only demonstrated violins, flutes, and oboes. So you could see what adding some pitched percussion would sound like, or even adding back in piano. I know a lot of orchestrators just starting out get a bit intimidated by the number of choices, and I definitely felt that at one point as well. But try to have fun and remember, even just having strings playing normal sustains will sound good. Sometimes keeping things very simple will allow the players to focus less on the technique and more on making the music come to life. Even though I only looked at 8 measures today, I hope that this video was helpful. I'll continue orchestrating this piece in the next video, and I'll specifically be looking at how I orchestrate the transitions between sections of the piece. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.